Scientists at a leading American genetics laboratory have confirmed the bone fragments found last year do belong to two of Tsar Nicholas II's children, the final missing members of Russia's last royal family.
For 60 years, the world believed at least one Romanov child escaped the massacre. DNA just proved every single one of them was lying. In 2007, scientists extracted genetic material from bones that had been burned, dissolved in acid, and buried for 90 years. What they found ended the greatest royal mystery of the 20th century and exposed one of history's longest-running frauds. But here's the catch. The truth was hiding in a forest the entire time, waiting for someone brave enough to dig when digging was forbidden. The night everything ended, July 17th, 1918. Yekaterinburg, deep in the Ural Mountains. A house with whitewashed windows so the prisoners couldn't see out. Guards woke the Romanov family at midnight. "Get dressed. You're being moved. The White Army is approaching. For your own safety." Tsar Nicholas II carried his son, Alexei, the 14-year-old heir, who couldn't walk because hemophilia had destroyed his joints. The Tsarina Alexandra clutched her jewelry case, still believing rescue was coming. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, wore corsets lined with diamonds, sapphires, and rubies, hidden wealth sewn into their undergarments for a life in exile that would never come. They were led down narrow stairs to a basement room. 11 people total. The family, their doctor, 3 loyal servants who had refused to abandon them, and a small dog named Jimmy. The room was small, no furniture, no windows, just bare walls and a single door. Yakov Yurovsky, commander of the Bolshevik Guards, entered with 11 armed men. He read a brief statement. The Ural Soviet had ordered their execution. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What?" before the firing began. 12 armed men opened fire in a space the size of a bedroom. The room filled with smoke and screaming. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls. Some family members died instantly. Others survived the initial volley, protected by the pounds of jewels sewn into their clothing. The diamonds deflected bullets meant for their hearts. The guards panicked. They hadn't expected survivors. They turned to bayonets and rifle butts. The youngest daughter, Anastasia, was still breathing when they clubbed her to death. The family dog was bayoneted in the corner. 20 minutes, 300 years of Romanov dynasty. Gone in a basement that smelled of gunpowder and blood. The bodies were loaded onto trucks, driven to a forest called Koptyaki, and dumped in a shallow pit. Sulfuric acid was poured on their faces to prevent identification. 2 bodies, Alexei and 1 daughter, were burned separately and buried elsewhere. The executioners wanted confusion. They wanted doubt. The ghost of Anastasia. Within months, rumors swept across Europe like wildfire. The children had escaped. Anastasia was alive in Berlin. Alexei had been smuggled to safety by loyal soldiers. Royal Deti. Families from Britain to Spain received letters from people claiming to be the lost Romanovs. The most famous claimant surfaced in 1920. Police pulled a young woman from a Berlin canal after an apparent suicide attempt. She had no identification, no memory, she said. But gradually, fragments returned, nightmares about gunfire, flashes of a grand palace, a family she couldn't quite remember. Then the revelation. She was Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter of the Tsar. A sympathetic Bolshevik soldier had smuggled her out of Russia, hidden beneath the bodies of her dead family. She had wandered for years, traumatized, before ending up in Berlin. She called herself Anna Anderson. Her story captivated the world. She knew intimate details about palace life that only an insider could know. She recognized people from the Russian court who came to test her. She bore scars on her body that might match injuries from the execution. She spoke with knowledge of private family moments that had never been published. Anastasia's own aunt, Princess Xenia, visited repeatedly and left convinced. Other relatives were divided. Some believed passionately. Others called her a fraud. The debate split families and sparked lawsuits across multiple continents. For 60 years, the mystery consumed public imagination. Handwriting experts testified. Childhood friends were summoned. Psychiatrists examined her. Hollywood made movies. Ingrid Bergman played her story on screen. The case became one of the longest-running identity disputes in legal history. Anderson maintained her claim until her death in 1984. She married an American professor. She lived quietly in Virginia. She gave interviews. She never wavered. She never confessed. She also refused every single time to take a DNA test. But here's the catch. In a forest near Yekaterinburg, the evidence that would destroy her was waiting in the cold earth, preserved in fragments of bone, ready to speak the moment someone finally. The secret dig. In the summer of 1979, a Soviet geologist named Alexander Avdonin stood at the edge of a forest clearing near Yekaterinburg. His official permit said geological research. His real mission was treason. He was looking for bodies the government had spent 60 years denying existed. Avdonin had spent years gathering clues, old documents, whispered rumors, accounts from guards who had talked before they died. He believed the Romanovs were buried somewhere in this forest, in unmarked graves the Bolsheviks had tried to erase from history. His shovel hit bone within minutes, human bone. Then another fragment, and another. Remains tangled together, thrown into a pit like garbage, hidden beneath 60 years of forest growth and Soviet silence. Avdonin's hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the weight of what he had just found, the most sought-after grave in Russian history. The proof that would rewrite everything the government had claimed. But here is the catch. He couldn't tell anyone what he found for 12 years. Reporting the discovery meant watching the Soviet government bury the truth again, perhaps permanently. It meant KGB interrogations, prison, maybe worse. The Soviets had killed millions to protect their revolution. They would not hesitate to silence a geologist who had found evidence of their founding crime. So Avdonin made the hardest decision of his life. He photographed everything. He collected small bone samples. He marked the location with precision only he understood. Then he reburied the remains, covered his tracks, and walked away. He would wait. He would wait for the empire itself to fall. In 1991, it did. The Soviet Union collapsed. The grave was officially reopened with international forensic teams present. Scientists recovered 9 skeletons, badly decomposed after 70 years in harsh Siberian soil. The bones were broken, crushed, tangled. Acid had eaten away at tissue and features. Traditional identification methods were impossible. No fingerprints survived. No dental records matched. No faces remained to recognize. But deep inside the bone fragments, hidden in microscopic pockets that the acid hadn't reached, the DNA was still there, waiting. 70 years of silence were about to end. If this forensic detective story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss what the DNA revealed next: royal blood. In a British laboratory, geneticist Dr. Peter Gill hunched over his computer screen. The data was coming through. Genetic patterns from bones that had been dead for 70 years, extracted using techniques that hadn't existed when the bodies were buried. The patterns were unmistakable. 5 of the 9 skeletons belonged to a single family. 2 parents, 3 daughters. The DNA proved it beyond any statistical doubt. These people had lived together, died together, and been thrown into a pit together. But proving they were a family wasn't enough. Gill needed to prove they were the Romanovs. For that, he needed living royalty willing to give their blood. Empress Alexandra had been Queen Victoria's granddaughter. Her mitochondrial DNA, the genetic code passed only from mother to daughter through generations, could be traced through living descendants of that royal line. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth II, shared that same maternal ancestry, stretching back through European royalty. He agreed to provide a sample. Gill ran the comparison, then ran it again. The match was perfect. The mitochondrial DNA from the female remains aligned exactly with Prince Philip's genetic signature. The Empress and 3 of her daughters had been positively identified. Finding Nicholas was harder. Mitochondrial DNA traces maternal lines, not paternal. Scientists needed relatives who shared the Tsar's mother's ancestry, not his father's. The most obvious candidate, Nicholas's nephew living in Toronto, refused to cooperate. He wanted nothing to do with Soviet-era investigations. So, forensic genealogists traced the Romanov family tree back through generations of royal marriages, mapping connections across dozens of European houses. They found 2 distant relatives willing to help, the Tsar's great-niece and a Scottish duke named James Carnegie. Both provided samples. Both matched the male's skeleton. But there was one anomaly that made scientists pause. Nicholas's DNA showed something called heteroplasmy, a rare genetic variation where more than one type of mitochondrial DNA exists in the same person. Critics immediately seized on it. If the Tsar's DNA didn't perfectly match his relatives, how could anyone be certain? The answer came from an unexpected grave. Nicholas's brother, Grand Duke George, had died of tuberculosis in 1899. His remains still lay in St. Petersburg's imperial crypt. Scientists obtained permission to extract his DNA. George showed the exact same variation, the same rare anomaly, brothers sharing the same unusual genetic signature. The male skeleton in the mass grave was Tsar Nicholas II. The case was closed, but here's the catch. 2 children were still missing. The burned grave. The executioners had panicked on that night in 1918. 11 bodies. 1 truck that kept getting stuck in mud. Dawn approaching fast. Villagers who might wake and see. Their original plan was to dump everything down a mine shaft. It failed. The shaft was too shallow. Bodies were visible. They had to improvise under pressure. 9 bodies went into one pit. But 2 others, Alexei and one of his sisters, were dragged away separately. The executioners doused them with gasoline and sulfuric acid. They burned what they could. They buried the charred remains in a different location, 70 meters from the main grave. The logic was cruel, but effective. If anyone ever found the main burial site, they would count the bodies, find only 9, and assume 2 children had escaped. The mystery would never be solved. The fairy tales would live forever. The deception worked for 90 years. Amateur historians and professional archaeologists searched the Koptiaki forest for decades. They found nothing. The trees had grown. The landscape had changed. The burned grave had vanished into the Russian earth. until the summer of 2007. A team of archaeologists, working methodically outward from the main site, found a patch of soil that didn't match its surroundings. Subtle discoloration, different vegetation. Something had been disturbed here long ago. They dug carefully, brushing away decades of accumulated earth with tools meant for delicate work. What emerged was barely recognizable as human. Bone fragments, charred black, crumbling at the touch. The fire and acid had done their work. The executioners had tried to erase these children from existence, but not completely, not enough. Dr. Michael Cobble, a forensic geneticist at the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, received the fragments. He ran 3 separate tests using technology that hadn't existed when the original grave was found. Why DNA passed from father to son? Mitochondrial DNA from the maternal line. Autosomal markers for family connections. He processed the results, then he processed them again to be certain. The match was undeniable. The boy was Tsarevich Alexei, 14 years old when he died, heir to a throne that no longer existed. The young woman beside him was one of the Tsar's daughters, either Maria or Anastasia. The burning had destroyed too much material for absolute certainty on which one. But it didn't matter which daughter it was. What mattered was the mathematics. 7 Romanovs had died in that basement. 9 bodies were in the main grave, including 4 servants. 2 burned bodies were in the second grave. Every single member of the immediate imperial family was accounted for. Every claim of survival, every escaped princess story, every miraculous rescue tale that had captivated the world for 90 years. The fraud destroyed. But here is the catch. A tissue sample from a forgotten surgery was about to destroy everything she had built over 6 decades. When Anna Anderson had intestinal surgery in the late 1970s, the hospital followed standard procedure. They kept a tissue specimen, routine medical documentation, unremarkable, filed away and forgotten in a storage facility for years. No one thought it would ever matter. Anderson was just another patient with an unusual story about being Russian royalty. The sample sat in preservation, waiting for a purpose no one could have predicted. After the Romanov grave was discovered and DNA technology advanced enough to work with old biological material, researchers realized what they had. A tissue sample from the woman who had spent 60 years claiming to be Grand, Duchess Anastasia. Physical evidence that could be compared directly against the bones from that forest. They obtained the specimen. They extracted the DNA. They ran it against the Romanov genetic profiles. The geneticist checked his results 3 times. He wanted absolute certainty before he destroyed a legend. Anna Anderson shared no genetic connection to the Romanov family. None. Not a single marker aligned. Not a single strand of her DNA matched the Empress, the Tsar, or any of the children buried in that grave. The woman who had convinced relatives, won court cases, and captivated the world had no biological relationship whatsoever to the people she claimed as family. She wasn't even Russian. Her DNA matched the Shanskowska family from Poland. Historical records showed that Franziska Shanskowska, a young factory worker with a history of mental illness, had vanished from a Berlin psychiatric institution around the same time Anna Anderson first appeared in that canal. Investigators had suspected this connection for decades, but without DNA evidence, they couldn't prove it. Now they could, beyond any doubt. For 60 years, Franziska Shanskowska had lived a lie so complete it consumed her entire existence. She had studied the Romanovs obsessively, memorizing palace details, learning Russian customs, absorbing every piece of published information about the family. She had fooled Princess Xenia. She had convinced journalists and historians. She had fought legal battles across continents. Science didn't care about her dedication. Science didn't care about the 60 years she had invested. Science only revealed truth. Every tear she had shed for her murdered family was performance. Every memory she shared was fabrication. The fairy tale that had captivated the 20th century was a con built on bones she had never seen. The truth comes home. In 1998, 80 years after the massacre, the Romanov remains were finally laid to rest. The ceremony took place at St. Petersburg's Peter and Paul Cathedral, the sacred burial ground of Russian emperors stretching back to Peter the Great. The same cathedral where Nicholas's father lay. The same cathedral where his grandfather rested. The dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries would finally sleep together. Tens of thousands of Russians lined the streets in silence. World leaders attended. Romanov descendants flew in from Britain, Spain, Denmark, Germany, and across the globe to witness the burial of relatives they had never met but had mourned their entire lives. President Boris Yeltsin stood before the coffins and called it a moment of national reconciliation, an acknowledgement of crimes committed in the name of revolution, a closure that had taken most of a century to achieve. The coffins were lowered into the imperial crypt. The family was together again. Not everyone accepted the conclusion. The Russian Orthodox Church wanted additional verification before recognizing the remains as relics of saints. Distant relatives questioned whether political motivations had influenced the investigation. Conspiracy theorists seized on every technical detail they didn't understand, spinning alternative explanations from their confusion. But the controversy didn't change what the DNA proved. Multiple independent laboratories confirmed the results. British scientists working separately from Russian scientists, working separately from American scientists. Different methodologies, different equipment, same conclusion. The evidence was, in one geneticist's careful words, nearly irrefutable. The final revelation. The Romanov mystery haunted the 20th century because the Soviet government wanted it to. They hid the bodies in that forest. They sealed the records in classified archives. They threatened anyone who asked questions. They created the deliberate silence that allowed Anna Anderson to flourish, that let fairy tales take root in the absence of facts, that gave hope to people who couldn't accept that a family had been butchered in a basement and thrown away like trash. For 90 years, people could believe whatever they wanted because no one could prove otherwise. No one could examine the evidence. No one could test the claims. The truth was buried, literally and figuratively, and the lies grew in the space where truth should have been. The bones in that forest held the answer the entire time. They waited through decades of Soviet rule, through Stalin's purges, through the Cold War, through the collapse of an empire that had tried to erase them from history. They waited for someone brave enough to dig when digging meant prison or worse. They waited for science advanced enough to read what they had preserved in their molecular structure for 70 years. Alexander of Donin found them. Peter Gill decoded them. Michael Koppel confirmed them. And the truth finally emerged, not as speculation or theory, but as genetic fact written in the language of DNA. Today, all 7 Romanovs rest together in St. Petersburg. The Tsar, the Tsarina, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei. The dynasty that ruled Russia for 300 years has found its final peace. No survivors, no escaped princesses, no fairy tale endings, just the truth, written in fragments of burned bone and strands of ancient DNA, proving that science always catches up to lies, even lies that lasted 60 years, even lies that fooled the world. So, do you think the world was better off believing the fairy tale, or was the truth worth the 90-year wait? Drop your answer in the comments. If this story blew your mind, smash that like button and subscribe for more mysteries finally solved by science. Click the video on your screen now to see what else history has been hiding.